We have a massive housing crisis in the United States.
Someone is not making an active choice to have their existence be trespassing.
Where do we put them if every city, every village, every town lacks compassion and passes a law identical to this? Where are they supposed to sleep?
The idea that the humane thing to do is to allow people to live in a public park or on a sidewalk is insane.
How can we live in the wealthiest country in the history of this planet and allow this to happen?
We can't arrest our way out of homelessness.
There's so many layers of wrongness in all of this.
If we can't keep people from falling into homelessness to begin with and build more affordable housing quickly, this is it.
Humans build systems, but what happens when our systems begin threatening humans? On today's episode, we sit down with national advocates, authors, and nonprofit leaders to explore past and present system failures that are now pushing Americans from their homes to the streets and are perpetuating homelessness in the wealthiest nation on earth. Join us as we talk about homelessness, because there's no issue that's closer to home.
My name is Greg Colburn.
My name is Ann Oliva.
I'm Jeff Olivet.
My name is Dakshika Wikrama.
My name is Kim Roberts. Welcome to Homeland. And then I can talk really fast. And if I am, just tell me.
Yeah, we have the ability to edit all this, so I'll just be like, I'll do like a single.
Yeah.
Yeah. Today's guest is Kim Roberts, Chief Programs Officer at LA Family Housing.
I've been with the agency for about 8 years, and I've been in homeless services for almost 15.
Can I ask you what brought you to homeless services as a career? What kind of led you to this work?
So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I went to school to get my MSW, and in that process really discovered that homelessness was the space that I wanted to be in, sort of by accident. I realized that my own experience in life would be really helpful in that. So I grew up in San Diego, about 15 minutes from the U.S.-Mexico border. I definitely remember sort of that traditional childhood, like riding bikes and the swimming pools and all of that. We lived in an apartment building as a kid and had a really strong community of neighbors and, have dinner together and sleepovers and all the things that kids should do.
Yeah.
And I vividly remember just feeling really safe and secure in that community. Until I was about probably 9 or 10 years old. My parents separated around that same time, and my mom had pretty significant addiction and mental health issues that she was really struggling with. And I think the combination of being unsettled in a separation or divorce, paired with some of the things that she was trying to overcome, really made it difficult for a sense of stability long term. And so from about, again, age 9 or 10 through most of my teen years, we were either homeless, living in motels and cars, couch surfing, staying with friends or family, and then a lot of just housing insecurity, where we would find an apartment, stabilize for a little while, and then, not be able to pay rent and be evicted. In the same way that I have memories of swimming in swimming pools and riding bikes, I also have memories of coming home from school and not knowing if the sheriff would lock us out that day. We had multiple evictions over a series of years that would lead to situations where we'd come home and all of our stuff would be outside. And so for about 10 years, there was this kind of periods of stability where we would have a home and things would be okay and my mom was doing well, and then it would sort of all fall apart. And then this cycle of homelessness would kind of repeat itself over and over and over.
What were some of the things that, as a kid, you're feeling? What are thoughts that are coming to your head as there's this unsettledness or this period of time where you come home and all your stuff's outside?
Yeah, I think when I reflect back on that, I definitely remember thinking, how come no one's helping? And it was a broad feeling. It wasn't like I was looking for a family member to step in or something like that. That was a part of it, but it was an understanding even innately at that age that this wasn't normal, and then that people shouldn't experience this sort of constant stress.
There's a lot of blame. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of sort of saying you're in this situation because you made bad decisions.
Here's Jeff Olivet, Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness.
When you really look at how contemporary homelessness exploded on the nation's landscape 30, 40 years ago, it was because we were disinvesting in affordable housing, in social safety net systems that kept people stably housed. And the rise in homelessness that we saw through the 70s, 80s, and up to today really had to do with our deep cuts in affordable housing. If you look at the HUD budget through the 70s and 80s, it was slashed by 80%. The federal investment in affordable housing, the number of units available in 1970 were not plentiful, but we had a surplus of 300,000 units of affordable housing. Now we have a deficit of millions of units. According to one estimate, it's over 7 million units of deeply affordable housing that we would need. So we've dug ourselves into this hole. So when we talk about structural causes, when we talk about systemic analysis of why homelessness exists, it really has to do with that.
Wow. Is this what we're dealing with right now, this explosion in homelessness across the country? It sounds like this is just the logical result of the policy decisions we've made over decades. Would you say that's what it
I think
is?
that's right, yeah.
Wow.
The homeless crisis wasn't created overnight. Decades old, short-sighted policies created cracks in our systems. These cracks, left unaddressed, have become gaping canyons. What do we mean when we say
System.
the global system or
Yeah.
the national system that's failing people?
When I talk about the biggest mainstream system,
You may remember Dakshika Wickrama from episode 1, Deputy Secretary of Homelessness at the State of California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency.
I'm talking about the laws that said in the 40s and 50s that Black people couldn't own housing. A Black mother with kids in the social services system was many, many more times more likely to fall into homelessness than her white or Latino counterpart, single mother with kids, right? And then those other systems are the systems that are supposed to help, like the healthcare system or the employment, roughly speaking, which is not really a system, but it's a collection of laws to make sure you can get an income. Where when people, Black and white men, went for interviews with the same qualifications, but the white man had a criminal record, the white man was more likely to be called back for an interview than the Black man with no criminal record and the same qualifications. So those are also systems at play, right? That keep people at a lower economic level.
There are multiple broken systems. It's critical we understand the impacts these systems have on housing and homelessness. Several months ago, I was at the Housing First conference in Atlanta when I heard Greg Colburn speak about his book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. During his speech, I pulled up my laptop, emailed a colleague, and asked if she could make an introduction. She did. Greg and I connected later that evening, and he agreed to be part of the podcast. I want to talk to you about your book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. My first question is just what led you to write this book? What led up to it?
Yeah, so I moved to Seattle in 2017. There weren't a lot of people at UW at that point that were studying housing and homelessness. And so because that was a focus of mine, I quickly got invited into all of these community conversations. And as the newcomer, I would just kind of sit and listen because I wanted to learn my way around and learn the people. And I would kind of leave these meetings and scratch my head and say, I don't think we really understand what's going on. The only thing we agreed on was that it was a problem and it was getting worse. And so the purpose of the book was really to just translate what we've known in the academic literature about the causes of homelessness, such that if you're living in Los Angeles or Seattle, walking around saying, why is the problem so bad here? Well, here's the answer. And it's hopefully written in a way that it's accessible if you haven't gone and gotten a PhD in social science.
You start off the book identifying this crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is that crisis?
That's a good question. So what is the crisis? I kind of think it depends on how broad you want to go. What I try to do in my work is try to draw these competing camps of understanding together. I fundamentally believe that the housing crisis in Seattle that made it hard for me to find housing when I moved here in 2017 with my family, that makes it hard for third grade teachers to find housing in Seattle, is the exact same crisis that's producing the crisis that leaves Joe on the street on 3rd Avenue, who's experiencing homelessness. And so we can talk discreetly about the crisis of homelessness or unsheltered homelessness or chronic homelessness, and that's all legitimate. But I fundamentally believe that we need to think about that we have a massive housing crisis in the United States that has lots of different consequences, one of which is the crisis of homelessness.
That's fascinating to me that the same crisis that's impacting people who are working class, trying to find housing, is the same crisis that's impacting, like you said, Joe, who's on the street. I don't think we think about it that way. I don't think we put ourselves in the same boat. But what you're saying is it's the same boat. We're all in it.
We're all in it, and the consequences are different for different people. The consequences for us were we got outbid on 25 straight houses when we were trying to buy a house in Seattle.
Wow.
And it was frustrating and painful, but ultimately we're fine. The consequences for a third grade teacher is not that he or she's going to experience homelessness, but it might be that they have an hour or hour and a half commute to get into the city, to work with the students that they're in the community that they're serving, but they have to live an hour and a half away. For people with lower incomes, they may not have the flexibility that I had or the third grade teacher had to come up with something else. And the consequence for them is I now no longer have stable housing. And so they're very different consequences, but this housing crisis spreads very broadly and it touches everyone. We just have not done a very good job of creating a housing system that accommodates people who are in different stations of life, in different economic circumstances. And unfortunately, we're living with the consequences of that inaction.
What were some of the things that you or your family lost access to during that time?
I think there was a lot of practical and there was a lot of emotional. Practically, we lost our stuff. Literally had to give away our dogs. There was periods of time where you had what you had with you. Certain times we'd have everything go to storage and you'd never see it again. Even to this day, there's, I have one bag of family photos. That's it. And so
Wow.
not knowing, not having that sort of rooted history of who your family is or what just basic things like your Christmas photos. I don't have those things because over the years they were lost. So there's a lot of that kind of practical experience that I imagine a lot of people go home on the holidays and everyone takes out their board games or things that your childhood memories and you revisit. We don't have that. In the moment, I think there was that kind of physical loss of things. Deeper than that and more emotionally, it was the sense of safety that I think we all are just innately looking for that you don't have anymore. So there isn't that home base, both in real time. So I come home from school, I don't know where I'm going that day. And then now as an adult, I don't have a home to go home to when I visit, San Diego. You didn't have that same sense of security or a groundedness.
We've had a lot of conversations with folks over the past few months about their own personal experiences. And you're the first one that's talked about not having the physical, tangible history of you and your family. But I think that's actually a really powerful thing to think about.
Yeah.
That there are artifacts that tell our story, that tell the story of our family. And when people are going through a season like this, those often get left behind.
Yeah.
Or, in some cases, this, when folks are, their stuff's being swept, they get taken from them. That's a really powerful thing to think about.
Yeah, the practical application of that, you feel so removed from what is normal. And it absolutely shapes you. Not having shapes you as much as having. And I definitely think that you can't miss that. You can't forget about that.
Yeah.
In your research, what did you find to be some of the conventional beliefs we hold about what are the actual causes of homelessness?
So the question of what causes homelessness is a tricky one. One of the challenges we have is that there are causes at the individual level. When you ask a question of what causes Greg to experience homelessness, we start to think about what individual attributes might Greg have that might contribute to him experiencing homelessness. And the academic literature is very clear on that. If I'm poor, if I'm a person of color, if I'm addicted, if I'm mentally ill, if I'm physically disabled, if I'm old. All of those are individual attributes or factors that will increase the risk of experiencing homelessness. So those we would call causes. So when someone says drug use causes homelessness, you're right, it does. If I'm addicted, I'm more likely to experience homelessness.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, though, with that individual analysis is that then becomes the narrative. And that narrative is built by walking down the street and seeing Joe and there's a needle next to Joe. And we'll say, well, of course, drugs causes homelessness. I just saw Joe on the street and there's a needle next to him. Our analysis then is a little different. And what we're trying to say is what at a community level causes high levels of homelessness? Why do Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, and DC have the highest levels of homelessness in the United States?
Yeah.
It would be reasonable to say, if you have these individual attributes that cause homelessness, if you have more people with those attributes, you'll have more homelessness. Like from a logic standpoint, that makes perfect sense. And it turns out that's not the case. So what we argue in the book is that it's the availability of housing, or more importantly, the lack of availability of housing, that determines why some places have lots and lots of homelessness. So it doesn't mean that these individual attributes aren't important.
Yeah.
But if your goal is for our coastal cities to have lower rates of homelessness, where we should be focusing is ensuring that there's a lot more affordable housing. Because people are using and abusing drugs in every jurisdiction in the United States. There are actually more poor people in places like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and St. Louis than in our coastal cities, and they don't have tons of homelessness. And there are people experiencing mental illness all over the place in the United States. And so is treatment important? Of course it is. We have a moral, ethical obligation to provide that treatment. You know, Seattle, San Francisco, LA have 5 times the homelessness of Chicago. If we want to look more like Chicago, the path to that is ensuring that we have a lot more housing that's affordable for people. We're not going to treat our way and get us down from 5 times to 1 times.
I want to dive in on one thing that you brought up. So you're finding that rates of homelessness are lower in communities with higher poverty rates than in other places. And that seems massively contradictory. One would think if poverty, pushes people to kind of that brink where they really can't afford basic necessities, housing being one, cities that have high poverty should have high rates of homelessness. You found otherwise. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest head scratcher in the book, because it is completely contradictory with what reasonable assumption would be. Of course, homelessness is a poverty problem, right? Of course, it's not just housing. But the fundamental point here is that without housing, we aren't going to end this. And so I would never suggest that this isn't a poverty problem. But at a community level, it's very clear that homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not amidst poverty.
Wow.
What that means is that being poor in an affluent place has different consequences than being poor in Detroit or Cleveland.
Yes.
And so why is it easier to be poor in Detroit or Cleveland? And it's no picnic. I'm not suggesting that poverty is not a problem. But if you are below the federal poverty line in Detroit and Cleveland, there is housing that's available for you.
Yeah.
If you're below the federal poverty line in Seattle or San Francisco or Los Angeles, there is no housing that's even close to being sufficiently affordable for you. And so on a per capita basis, we have actually a lot fewer poor people in Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. But we have 5 times the homelessness.
There's a lot of folks who look at the homeless crisis in Los Angeles, and the first question that comes to mind is, if it's so expensive, if it's so hard to live there, why don't people just move?
People usually who are homeless or become homeless in LA, you've seen the data, they have been living in LA. It's not like they moved here. They've been going to school here. They have a job here. They have family here. They have been here usually for at least a year, sometimes for 10 years, right? The vast majority of people were living here when they became homeless. Moving is very expensive, believe it or not. It is not a cheap thing to do. It is actually a luxury to be able to pick up sticks and move one state or even multiple states. If there's any movement, it's really to adjoining cities because people can't see the city boundaries. So they are staying very close to where they live or where they became homeless. Imagine if you're homeless and you don't have money to afford housing in California. Where are you going to go? And that plane ticket, or you don't have a car, you don't have fuel, gas. It's very expensive to move. So it might be easy to say they should just move. That's because those folks who say that have money to move and maybe have moved, and they had a job to move to that paid relocation services, or they were able to find housing elsewhere. So that's why it's not as easy as just moving.
We draw a distinction in the book between precipitating events that can cause a bout of homelessness, domestic violence, for example. That clearly can cause someone to experience homelessness. We would argue that that is a precipitating event, just as a relational breakdown or an addiction or a job loss or something could precipitate an event of homelessness.
Here's Greg Colburn again.
We draw a distinction between those causes and what we would call root causes, which we are arguing is the fundamental lack of housing. And these two are not, one isn't right, one isn't wrong. They work together. They interact to produce homelessness. So the metaphor is musical chairs, 10 friends, 10 chairs. There's a leader. The leader starts playing music. They all start walking around in a circle. At some point, the leader takes one chair out. We now have 10 people and 9 chairs. When the leader stops the music, everyone scrambles for a chair. And by definition, someone loses. And in our story, the loser was Mike, who had sprained his ankle, was on crutches. And so therefore, when the music stopped, he was unable to move quickly when there was a scramble for the chairs, and he ended up losing the game. And so if we ask Mike, what caused you, think about this in a causal sense, what caused you to lose the game? Mike would say, well, I had a bad ankle. And everyone who played the game would say, well, of course, that caused Mike to lose the game. If we ask a different question, which is, why didn't Mike have a chair? Well, it's because we didn't have 10 chairs. We only had 9 chairs. And so we use this metaphor to highlight what's going on in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle right now, which is when housing is scarce, it accentuates vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities highlight the people who are most likely to lose this vicious game of musical chairs that we have in our housing market right now. And then we're all guilty of this. We walk down the street and we see Joe on the street and there's a needle next to him and say, well, of course Joe's homeless. He's addicted. Of course Mike didn't have a chair. He had a bad ankle. Instead of thinking about the structural deficit of chairs or housing, which is fundamentally explaining this crisis. And that then feeds into this narrative that perpetuates, and it's not wrong, addiction clearly can cause homelessness, but we then attribute the crisis to drug use as opposed to attributing it to a fundamental deficit of housing, which is going to create real challenges for people who are vulnerable, who are poor, who have been discriminated against, who are physically disabled, who are addicted, whatever the case may be.
It sounds like we're misdiagnosing the problem, and therefore we are prescribing the wrong solution. If we're saying, well, see, the needle, causation, homelessness because of substance use or untreated substance use. And if that's our diagnosis, then our policies will look to address substance use, as opposed to what you're saying, hey, the chair was missing. It accentuated the vulnerability. I think that's an incredible analogy.
It's exactly right. And it's important to say that it doesn't mean that treatment isn't important.
Yeah, and of course.
We should want to treat Joe and help Joe deal with that addiction. And I say, though, that, and I wish I had this magic wand. If I could end all addiction and mental illness in Seattle tomorrow, I would love to wave that magic wand. And if I did, we would still have a problem with homelessness. It might manifest itself a little differently. But fundamentally, we don't have enough chairs, and we need to create more chairs that are affordable for people. And the final point here is we are creating and exacerbating a behavioral health crisis by not housing people. We don't know if Joe's addiction was the cause of his homelessness or it's just a coping mechanism. Right? We know that mental illness and addiction are a logical human consequence to the trauma of experiencing homelessness. And so if we want less drug use in the streets, let's try to get people housed. Let's get people housed.
What brought this period of time to an end? Was there a moment when things did settle kind of for good moving forward?
So for me, they did. I left San Diego, moved to LA, went to college, and was able to sort of take on life pretty independent of my family. So I was able to stabilize. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for my mom. So I was able to get my mom connected to some programs in San Diego. She was able to get treatment and stabilize in housing. But her addiction and her mental health never totally settled. She was actually in permanent supportive housing, relapsed, and unfortunately overdosed and passed away.
Sorry.
Thank you. I think I'm still really grateful for the fact that she was indoors, she was safe, while she was still struggling with her mental health and her addiction, she was in housing, and she was able to manage that in a different way. And I do think that allowed her a good season of stability that I hadn't seen in her in a really long time. Wow. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've had a very impactful experience, and you deeply understand this work from your personal experience and your family's personal experience. How does that show up when you are in your role as Chief Programming Officer, when you're in your role in multiple different kind of seats that you have in LA County? How does that show up in those spaces?
Yeah, I think it's who I am. So recognizing that I don't think that like someone is coming to the work because they have lived expertise, or someone is coming to the work because they have, a degree in social work. I'm fortunate that I have both of those things, and so I try my best to sort of bridge practical experience with sort of the theory of all of it. I definitely think in the day-to-day, it shows up in the way that I hope our team is able to deliver service and meet people where they are. I obviously have a soft spot for our family system, recognizing, just what it's like to be in that space and to see kids who often don't have any control of the situation. They're sort of just in it. I remind our team a lot that the engagement of a human is very different than just like delivering a service. It's not just the check that we're able to cut for the landlord, but it's being able to sit in real time in a space and hold that space for someone who's often really stressed out and incredibly traumatized and maybe having the worst day of their entire life. Like, to really start at the human element is a completely different experience than come in, wait here, we'll get to you when we can.
Yeah.
I think a lot of social services is rooted in just getting it done because the demand is so great on us and the resources are so limited. And in this space with this population, it can't be that. And that sometimes can be in direct conflict with what we're being asked to do or what the community is asking us to do. But it's so critical that we just stop and remember these are human beings who are experiencing things that they should never have to experience.
Yeah.
Obviously, homelessness is a problem. It's a stark problem. But given the scale of it, you said about 1/5 of 1% of the national population are experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. Our preoccupation with it kind of dwarfs the actual scale when you compare it to other social issues that are going on. And so can you talk to us a little bit about why we are so preoccupied with this? You said a party. We're all talking about housing. Why?
So 650,000 was the last point in time count for homelessness in the United States. As of January 23, we know that that's an undercount. It's hard to count homelessness. And if you have broader definitions of homelessness, it might be 1 million or 2 billion people. We can argue about that. But when you compare that to poverty, for example, let's say that's 30, 40 million households in the United States experiencing poverty. We aren't talking about poverty at parties, but we're talking about homelessness. Why? There's an emotional response to homelessness, especially unsheltered homelessness, which is more prevalent on the West Coast. For some people, it is, as we say, an indictment of the capitalist system. How can we live in the wealthiest country in the history of this planet and allow this to happen? I personally am outraged by that, and that's one of the reasons why I study this. And then there are other people who say, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles are 3 of the greatest cities in the United States, and homelessness is literally ruining the city. How can we let this happen? If we need to round people up and get them out of here to save the city, let's do it. There's very few people who are kind of agnostic about it. Like, oh, it doesn't, I don't have an opinion. No, people have very, very strong opinions. Homelessness doesn't allow us to ignore it.
And it's gone on far too long. Dozens of demonstrators gathered outside the U.S. Supreme Court with signs reading, "Housing, not handcuffs."
Housing is a human right. Every citizen deserves the right to sleep in the richest country in the history of the world.
We are in front of the Supreme Court, homeless advocates from all over the country in a collective voice to say homelessness is not a crime.
The tiny city of Grants Pass, Oregon, now in the national spotlight.
There's not been a homelessness case that has gone this far through the legal system
ever.
On Monday, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in the case, which could have big implications on the homeless crisis and how it's managed across the country.
The idea that the humane thing to do is to allow people to live in a public park or on a sidewalk is insane.
The heart of the question is whether these laws classify as cruel and unusual punishment.
Where do we put them if every city, every village, every town lacks compassion and passes a law identical to this? Where are they supposed to sleep?
So something else happened this summer, and I want to ask you about it. Can you summarize for our listeners just the basic premise of the case?
The situation was that the city of Grants Pass, Oregon, is a town of about 40,000 people.
This is Jeff Olivet, Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness.
At any moment in time, they had something like 700 people experiencing homelessness. That's a snapshot estimate. And only 100 shelter beds. And those shelter beds were operated by a local rescue mission that also had a lot of programmatic requirements that obviously work for some people, but not for everybody.
Yeah.
So you have hundreds of people with no place to sleep.
The city of Grants Pass passed a number of ordinances that, in effect, made it impossible for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness to be in their community.
This is Anna Leva, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
And what I mean by that is that they were fining and ticketing people for things like sleeping in a public space when there was not actually shelter or housing available to those folks.
We'll hear argument first this morning in Case 23-175, City of Grants Pass versus Johnson. Ms. Evangelos.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, like cities nationwide, Grants Pass relies on camping laws to protect.
At the time of our recording at First Friday, where a group of homeless service system leaders and providers gathered together, the Grants Pass case was still being deliberated by the Supreme Court.
Hey,
awesome.
3 cheers for Jonathan Grilli.
Yes.
Kicking it over to Ben.
Thank you. So there is a case that we're very familiar with, Grants Pass, which is before the Supreme Court. And in the event that a decision is made by the Supreme Court where cities, communities are allowed to say, this is actually something we can criminalize, this is a lever we can pull. What are some of the practical implications that LA would feel or Los Angeles County would feel if that is the new reality?
I mean, realistically, we'll see homelessness get worse.
How so?
I was just reading about some of the facts in Grants Pass, and the amount of the first ticket, I think, was something like $250. And then if you didn't pay it on time, it went up to $500. And if you didn't pay that, then you were subject to arrest and like 30 days imprisonment, $1,200 fine. How does that reduce homelessness? All it does is increase prison populations and make people unable to work, because when you have those kinds of government debts, it puts limitations on you, limitations on your driver's license, all sorts of things. It is absolutely ineffective. It would make things worse.
I think it's a cultural shift that says that homelessness isn't a status, It is how you are operating. I think that's, to me, what struck me about the Supreme Court stuff was really the conversation about saying it's the conduct of the person that's the problem. But the conduct of the person is based upon them being homeless, which is a status, right?
It's gonna shift funding too. Like where now you're just shifting funding towards the criminalization and building more prisons, and it's not gonna solve anything. It's just gonna create a different pipeline. Instead of housing, a cell. That's really what it's gonna do.
Like if you're saying that it's illegal, if it's considered trespassing to sleep on private property, and it's also now illegal to sleep on public property, you are criminalizing someone's existence. And so I think, like, just from a very simple logical perspective, like, truly, what is it that you're doing, especially for communities where you have a homeless population that exceeds the amount of resources and or physical beds that can accommodate that? Someone is not making an active choice to have their existence be trespassing because property has more right than a human does.
Door that would open for me that is really worrisome is that, in my mind, it would almost incentivize an enforcement race to the bottom, where as a city, if I can make my rules slightly more draconian than my neighbor, that is the only tool I need to like resolve homelessness within my boundaries, because that would force everyone to that city, which then incentivizes them to like do the same. And
It's
there's
like a
no
mass migration almost between cities.
It allows a tool for resolution that isn't actually housing. It's that, but at this like colossal scale where the geography people have to cross now like puts them out of the range of the service provider they had connection with, or into places where they don't have maybe relationships or know how to get their basic needs met. It's going to endanger people.
And I think too, like as y'all are saying, like it'll be a lever or an option that communities have available to them in the event that there's a global event coming, right? Or in the event that like the Super Bowl is coming or the Olympics are coming. Those are coming, right? So like they are coming. That's a part. But it is an option that cities will have, which is an easy solution. It's an easy fix for a couple months, couple weeks to deal with something, as opposed to actually doing the hard work that's really required to bring about an end to homelessness on their streets. And so I don't think there's a better word than draconian. Like I can't think of a better word to kind of capture that.
Do you anticipate there being unintended consequences that local communities feel, or we as a country feel, based on this decision? Do you foresee any unintended consequences of this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think fundamentally, we can't arrest our way out of homelessness. It's not a solution. I know there's an outcry from the public who just want those encampments gone, or on the upside, they want those folks to be taken care of. But you don't do that through jailing them. You do it through providing housing and case management and access to drug and alcohol treatment and mental health care. So, we know at a really basic level that housing and wraparound supports solve homelessness. Criminalizing the situation of homelessness doesn't solve it. And in fact, it's expensive, it's ineffective. There's no proof that these kinds of laws actually do anything to reduce homelessness. They might put it out of sight for a little while, but what they're doing is creating a very difficult revolving door where people are just cycling in and out of jails and homelessness. And in fact, it's counterproductive. It makes it harder for folks to get housing, to get a job, to reconnect with community.
You mentioned that there's no proof that these types of activities actually reduce homelessness, whereas on the other hand, we do have proof around best practices. We have proof around certain activities that do end homelessness. In your opinion, why do we keep gravitating this way? Why are there certain trends where, even though there's no proof, we want to have this as a tool?
I mean, I'll take that a step further and say that we've tried this before and it hasn't worked. If you look back at the history of these kinds of laws, there were situations in Philadelphia in the 1820s where the police were rounding up homeless folks and putting them in jail. There was a law passed in the 1880s in Rhode Island called the Tramp Act that basically arrested folks, and it didn't solve homelessness. So we've got a track record we can look at of ineffective responses. To your question about why we keep going down those roads, I think the real solutions to homelessness take some time. They take patience. We've, as I said, dug ourselves into a deficit around affordable housing units. Housing development takes time. We have a lot of rebuilding to do around mental health access and drug and alcohol treatment access. And some of those things, first of all, they take money, and second, they take time to scale up. And I think the public is desperate for a response, and that's where some of the reactivity comes from.
We're coming on air with breaking news right now. The Supreme Court has ruled cities can enforce bans on homeless people.
Supreme Court is permitting cities to enforce bans on homeless people sleeping outside, even if shelter space is lacking.
It wound up being a 6-3 decision by the justices, with the outcome split down ideological lines.
The long-term implications could reshape homeless policy for years to come.
What do you anticipate are some of the implications of this type of ruling that will be felt nationally and locally?
I think it opens the door for communities to embrace harsher, more punitive approaches to homelessness. It allows cities to say, we're going to arrest people if they sleep in public. We're going to jail people who have no other place to go.
So nothing about this ruling helps people who are experiencing homelessness. And in fact, it hurts them.
Here's Anna Leva again, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness.
It makes getting out of homelessness harder. And it not only hurts them, it hurts the providers who serve them, and it hurts the system that serves them. And here's what I mean by that. People who are experiencing homelessness when they're fined, if they had $295 to pay a fine, they would be in a hotel room.
Yeah.
So it's nonsensical. Just on its face, it's nonsensical. But the fact is that when you rack up fines like that, often when they're not paid, it impacts your credit. And when they're not paid, they turn into bench warrants, and it can turn into criminal charges. So all of those things make it harder to get a job. It makes it harder to get a lease. So all of that just makes things much more difficult. I heard a story of a woman who had her son's ashes in her tent that got thrown out.
Oh, God.
So these are the kinds of things that really directly impact people who are experiencing homelessness with no benefit to them at all. And then it makes it harder for providers. Providers, as you know.
I do.
It makes it harder for people to find the folks that they're working with. It makes it harder for them to get folks into jobs and into leases. It makes it just harder for a frontline worker who already has an incredibly difficult job to do their work. And then at the systems level, all of this costs money. All of it costs money. Police who have to go around finding and ticketing and arresting people, jail time, the court system that has to process all of those citations, and if they turn into bench warrants, all of that costs money. Money that could be used to much more simply serve people who are experiencing homelessness and get them into housing.
Yeah.
So there's so many layers of wrongness in all of this that the Grants Pass case has opened the door to nationwide in a way that is really detrimental to the work that we're trying to do.
What's your advice to local governments who are grappling with how to respond to homelessness in their community and are tempted to now kind of take the easy way out, to just enforce criminalization, to move it off their streets? What would you say to those local governments?
I would say it's important to realize that there is a better way, that there are alternatives to criminalization. So I think the advice would be don't give in to the temptation to pass harsh laws. Hold firm to a more kind of moral compass of a compassionate response, and that involves stable housing and wraparound supports. There might be some steps you have to take in the interim to expand shelter availability, to lower the bar on what it takes to get into a shelter, to provide safe sleeping sites of various kinds, to rent, master lease a motel so you can move people in. There are a lot of things that communities are doing that are a better way, and I think I would just want people to hear that and know it.
It's a good question, and I get this question quite a bit from local governments themselves as well as from advocates. And I think that the first thing that we have to do is make sure that those elected leaders and those who are working in local government are well educated about what actually works to end homelessness, because we know this doesn't work. There's plenty of research about it. There's research about what actually works. We need to make sure that folks are educated if they're going to be making hard decisions, because they're under a lot of pressure. They're under a lot of pressure from housed people who are their constituents to be seen as doing something.
Yeah.
And we, advocates and service providers and other folks in our community, have to be able to back them up if they're going to be brave about this and if they're going to make hard decisions that are strategic but might not be as popular with folks who are housed or with folks who don't understand this issue.
When you think about the work that's being done in LA, what is it that is working, that is moving folks closer to home?
I actually think there's a lot that is working. And over the last few years, and I would say since COVID, we've seen a lot of improvements. The system has grown tremendously. I think there's a strong understanding within the system of what causes homelessness and a willingness to say systemic racism and inequalities are what's causing this, and not addiction and mental health and, all the other things. Those are a part of it, but it's not what's causing it.
Yeah.
There's a collective understanding of what will end this, and like a real understanding that if we could fix a broken system, we could actually stop this from happening altogether.
When we think about failure and success when it comes to the work that we do, what would failure look like if LA is unable to fix some of these larger systems? What would that materialize as? What would that look like?
We're housing enough people every year to end homelessness in the next, we housed almost 30,000 people last year. Mm-hmm. We got 70,000 on the street. That means 2.5 years from now, we should be done. However, when we're seeing, 2 to 3 people falling into homelessness for every person we house, this is it. Nothing changes. And so the reality would be encampments on the street. It can look like a war zone, and yet that would become normal. If we can't keep people from falling into homelessness to begin with and build more affordable housing quickly, this is it. I struggle with that. The image, when you know those encampments in your community where you're just like, how is this LA?
Yeah.
How is this California? How is this America?
Yeah.
And yet it is. And I don't see that going away unless we make some really drastic changes.
I worried that in 10 years, if we continue on the same path, we're going to look back and say 2024 was the glory days for homelessness. This will just continue to get worse.
Here's Greg Colburn again, author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem.
And I joke, it's like speaking to a toddler, but if you continue to make the same decisions, bad things will continue to happen. And that's what we're doing as cities, states, and the nation. We're continuing to make bad decisions, and then we get really frustrated that homelessness exists. Well, no kidding. We know what causes it. We continue to basically create that environment and accelerate that environment, and then we get frustrated that homelessness continues to grow. Well, we should probably do something different.
On the flip side, success. What would success mean for our city, for our communities, if we are able to move folks as a system into housing?
I think there's the immediate successes. We would see a reduction of people on the streets. But the then what is really important. And if our partner agencies, the city, the county, if we're not all really marching at the same beat and making sure that every service that could be offered to an individual that they need is aligned, accessible, person-centered, oriented in harm reduction, unless those things are happening, folks will continue to cycle through our systems. And we've struggled as a system, as a community, to really figure out how to align those things.
The reason why I am drawn to this is I fundamentally believe, and I'm very confident that we can end or radically reduce homelessness in my lifetime. I'm 51 years old, so give me another 40 years. In 40 years, we can make a huge dent in this. I am absolutely confident. The scale of this problem compared to other problems is manageable. The resources exist, the interventions exist, the knowledge exists, the goodwill exists. We can absolutely do that. So to me, this is not an exercise in banging one's head against the wall. It's not at all. Let's just do what we know works and do that at scale, and we will have great success. I'm confident of that.
Where do you find optimism? You've been in this work for a long time. What sustains you?
It's a difficult question. I think there's the day-to-day piece of it, and then there's the kind of bigger picture. day to day, we are housing people. Our team alone, just last in 90 days, housed 185 households.
That's incredible.
In 90 days. So that is inspiring. I think big picture, for me, homelessness is something that's actually solvable. We know exactly what to do. It is absolutely solvable. I want to work myself out of a job. And I think there's something about that that creates like urgency and motivation in ways that I don't think I would have if I worked in a different space.
What are national implications if LA were to move towards radically reducing homelessness and ultimately trying to bring it to an end?
I am deeply aware of the size and scale and urgency of addressing homelessness in Los Angeles. It is the epicenter of homelessness in the United States, especially unsheltered homelessness, as we know. And yet we're seeing some real bright spots. There's some extraordinary work going on with street medicine, with taking care out to where people are, with getting people out of encampments into motels often, and then on a pathway to permanent housing. And I think we see that happening even with the numbers that LA recently announced, where we really are seeing a bending of the curve in the right direction. So I think what LA has to teach the rest of the country is that it is possible, even in the toughest of circumstances, to solve homelessness.
I've been working in LA for a long time. I used to be in the federal government. LA was a focus for us for a variety of reasons that you are well aware of.
Yeah.
And we used to say something to the effect of, where LA goes or where California goes the nation. And I believe that. I think that if LA can solve these problems, if LA has brave leadership, folks who are strategic about the resources that they have and how they're using them, folks who are listening to people on the ground, including frontline staff, including people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think that if LA can turn this around, we have a proof point for the rest of the country. And if LA can do it, there's no excuse for anybody else.
Is there anything else you'd like to share just on the topic of homelessness with folks that are listening to this podcast?
I'd like people to remember that we have a choice. We have a policy choice about how we address homelessness. We can choose to pass harsh laws that punish people, or we can choose to invest in housing and services. We can choose to believe that it's possible. We can choose hope over despair. We can choose kindness over anger and finger pointing and partisanship. Those are choices, and they're decisions that we make as a society. What do we believe about taking care of folks who are often in the darkest days of their lives? Those are choices. They're policy choices. They're moral choices. So what choice are we going to make?
Systems are created by people. There are good systems and there are destructive systems. The family unit is a system. Your place of education, employment, or your faith community are systems. The judicial, political, and economic frameworks in the United States, all systems. The current housing and homelessness crisis is the direct result of a systems failure decades in the making. Ecosystems that are meant to help communities flourish are instead pushing people to the streets and continuing to perpetuate homelessness across the wealthiest nation on earth. While the scale of this failure is daunting and the change that's necessary immense, remember this: we create systems. We can transform them. Hey folks, earlier in the episode, some numbers were rounded up and down. While there were estimates and very close, we wanted to provide you with precise numbers. It was said that there were about 700 people who experienced homelessness in a given day in Grants Pass, but the Supreme Court decision references that it is around 600 people. It was also estimated to be about 100 shelter beds. The precise number is 138 shelter beds in Grants Pass at the time of the case. The fines are as follows. The first ticket is $295, not $250. And if unpaid, it goes to an exact $537.60. Lastly, once a person is cited twice for violating park regulations within a 1-year period, city officers can issue an exclusion order barring that person from the park for 30 days. A person who camps in the park after receiving that order commits criminal trespass, which is punishable by a maximum of 30 days in jail and a $1,250 fine. On our next episode, A Beautiful Mind, we explore the intersection of homelessness and mental health. All that and more next time on Homeland. We want to invite you to join the Homeland by subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information on how to gain a deeper understanding of homelessness, visit ourhomeland.us for additional content, photos, and more resources on how you can join the work of bringing people home. Homeland was created by myself, Ben Kay, and Fulcrum Productions, in association with Historia. The complete series is brought to you by United Way of Greater LA and distributed by PRX. This episode was written and produced by Ben Kay, Andrew Didway, and Daniel Jeter. Photography, additional production, and editing by Daniel Jeter. Our original music is by Jeffrey Emerson Geyser. Episode artwork by Philippe Martinez. Social media consulting is by Veronica Roy. Our podcast consulting crew consists of Marisol Bayo, Jerry Jones, Hazel Lopez, and Barbara Olson. Members of the Homeland Advisory Committee for this episode are Amara Ananiwu, Shannon Murray, Janine Solorio, Omar Gutierrez, Brad West, and Tawny St. James. I would like to say thank you to all those who helped us along the way and ultimately brought this project to life. This episode is dedicated to Chris Freed for being our advocate-in-chief, James Crocker for being a friend for all seasons and letting me record countless voiceovers at Cathedral when my apartment was too noisy, Veronica Lewis for graciously letting me go on leave time and time again to finish this podcast when I bit off more than I could chew, the A-team at Hopix for being the best team I've ever had. You are second to none, and never let anyone tell you otherwise. I love you all. Thanks for listening, folks. Let's keep talking.